Good morning, everyone. My name is Evan. I'm one of the ministers at St Mary's Anglican Church. And today, for Psalm a Day, we're looking at Psalm 57. If you haven't read the psalm, it would be a really good idea to do it now, because I'm not actually going to read much of it at all. I'm just going to focus on what the psalm is doing and trace a bit of a line through David to Jesus to how it can help us now. And so when we read the psalm, one of the first things we notice about it is in the superscription, we read that historically it's attributed to David. And as we keep going, we can read that it's actually a lament. It's one that's written with a theme of sadness, a cry out to God whilst someone is in pain, whilst the writer is in pain. But there's a particular theme to it. See, David, the who we would say is the writer. Now, sorry, before I go any further, usually I talk about the superscriptions and I say they're helpful or helpfully unhelpful, that sort of thing. I'm going to lean on them today, just because I think that kind of ties in my my teaching a little bit better. But whether it is actually David or not doesn't really matter. So I was saying that David is being persecuted, and the circumstance here is that David is being persecuted by Saul. Once again, that doesn't really matter to us, but we can get the vibe that there is a person who loves God, and that person is being persecuted. They're under attack. They are being abused. Particularly verse 4, I lie in the midst of lions, I lie among ravenous beasts whose teeth are sharp, whose teeth are spears and arrows, whose tongues are sharp swords. And so there's pain, there's anguish happening, and no doubt that the psalmist knows that they're in trouble. But what is their attitude? Because maybe when you read through, you might have thought when I said lament, oh, actually I don't think it's lament. Well, you'd be wrong. It's a lament. But it's that attitude which the psalmist takes into the lament, which I want us to notice. Yes, the psalmist is being persecuted. Yes, they're in pain. Yes, they're being attacked. But the praise for God throughout this persecution, throughout this pain, is always there. And the psalmist wants us to know that. He's always praising God, despite the pain that's going on. In fact, he's very confident that God will take the psalmist away from the circumstance and that God will follow through and punish those who are doing the misdeeds against the psalmist. We tend to, as Christians, read the Psalms through the lens of Jesus. And we don't attribute them to Jesus, but I don't know, what's a colloquial way of saying it is that the Psalms are Jesus' songbook, which is a bit lovey-dovey. How should I explain this? That they can also be read as Jesus' words to God, sometime during his life. And the kind of the passages that I'm leaning on to make that happen theologically is several bits in the Gospels where Jesus said, "Haven't you read the prophets and the wisdom? They are about me, or they told of me." And so that's not just one passage; that's a couple of them. If you'd like to know what they are, then hit me up, and I'd love to have a conversation with you about it. And so, what we take from that is, well, a lot of the Psalms are about Jesus and what Jesus is going through, and so in some ways they're prophetic because they look forward to what Jesus was going to do. But as we look back, we can see this, and it adds color, more color, I suppose, to the Gospels and what Jesus was going through. And so, this psalm, I read it as Jesus is being tortured, as Jesus is being prepared to go on the cross, or even on the cross himself. At that time, Jesus was still He never once turned away from God, but in fact he would have been glorifying his God. And so that's the attitude that he took in. Yes, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he wanted to. Oh, sorry. In the Garden of Gethsemane, he was nervous about what was coming, but he didn't once want God to be not want God to be glorified. He didn't not want to go through with the plan that he and his Father had done. And even though he was killed on the cross, verse 6, they spread a net for my feet. I was bowed down in distress. They dug a pit in my path, but they have fallen into it themselves. Jesus ultimately won at the cross. Even though it looked like defeat, it looked like he had been killed and beaten, but he won. And it was their enemies, it was the people who killed him who were ultimately tricked. It was Satan who was ultimately tricked. Now, from David through Jesus, we can come to us. And now, and the Bible will say elsewhere that we kill Jesus with our sin. But once we've given that over to him, and he is our Saviour, we live for Jesus. We live wholeheartedly for him. And a number of times in the Gospels and in other parts of the New Testament, Jesus and the apostles of Jesus will warn God's people that you will be persecuted and you will face troubles. Why? Because Jesus did as well. And since, one passage says the servant isn't greater than the master, or another one says, or in John says that they hated me and so they will hate you. But don't forget that they're actually hating me when they hate you. And it's like walking into, I can use a football illustration. This one's for you NRL fans. It's like walking through Penrith with a Wests Tigers shirt on. Is essentially what we do when we walk through the world, when we live our lives as Christians. We're going to have stuff thrown at us from cars. We're going to be booed. We're going to be hissed at. That's just a part and parcel of being a Christian. But instead of being a fan of the West Tigers, thank goodness, Jesus has victory every single time. And in fact has won for us. And we have assurance of the future to come and the glory to come. And so when we are persecuted for being Christians, and I know there are varying degrees for this, but when you are persecuted for being a Christian, this psalm teaches us to continue glorifying God, to continue praising God. Hey, buddy. To continue, because in that persecution, you are glorifying God. Remember, the reason why you're being persecuted is because you are standing up for Jesus. And so we can count those, as Paul will say, we can count those as joy. And so when we face pain, when we face persecution because we are Christians, let's take a lesson from this psalm. We can pray this psalm, we can read this psalm, and we continue verse 9, to praise you, O Lord, among the nations, and we will sing of you among the peoples, for great is your love, reaching to the heavens, your faithfulness reaches to the skies. Be exalted, O God, above the heavens, let your glory be over the earth. Grace and peace to you.